Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Suzanne. Thank you for coming to my talk, and thank you to the organizers for putting this all together for us. This has been a great conference. And I come from Fraunhofer, USA, and my specific Fraunhofer Center is the Center Midwest, and we're located on the campus of Michigan State University in East Lansing, Michigan. And my division is the Division for Coatings and Diamond Technologies, and I fall under the Diamond Technologies umbrella. And we work in a lot of different application areas involving diamond materials. But today I'm going to be focusing on what we do in terms of electrochemical oxidation of PFAS, and specifically our project dealing with landfill leachate solutions. So just a real quick outline of my talk. So I'm going to very briefly go over PFAS. I mean, we've heard this multiple times already in this conference, so we're all aware of what PFAS is and why we care about it. But then I'm going to go into electrochemical oxidation, if you're not familiar with that, and how we can use that to degrade PFAS in different solutions. And then cover boron doped diamond electrodes. So these are the electrodes that we use to degrade PFAS. So I'm going to talk about what those are, why we like to use those, and then get into the data on treating landfill leachate solutions, and finally wrap up with some ongoing efforts in our lab in this area. So just very briefly, the PFAS background, like we've heard multiple times, PFAS is everywhere. There's lots of various sources of contamination, and that makes its way into the environment and eventually into the water stream. And so water is really what I'm going to be talking about today. And so because of this, there's, a variety of health effects that are associated with PFAS exposure. So we have some regulations both on the national and on the state level for PFAS. And so the US EPA health advisory limit for PFOA and PFOS is 70 ppt. But on the state level, we can have different concentration limits. So here's some of the limits for Michigan shown here. And so the current remediation methods oftentimes focus on filtration absorption. So how can we remove PFAS from the water stream so we are not exposed to it? But this only solves part of the problem, because the question then becomes, what do you do with the PFAS after you remove it from the water stream? And that's where these different destructive technologies come in. So the type of destructive technology that we work with is electrochemical oxidation. And what this is taking a set of electrodes and submerging them in a solution containing PFAS. And what we do is we apply a high current density to that solution that is of sufficient energy to oxidize the bonds of these PFAS molecules. So there's a couple of structures shown here. And as we know, these are these carbon fluoride chains that have these very strong CF bonds. So it takes quite a bit of energy in order to break those bonds or oxidize those bonds. And so with electrochemical oxidation, there's a couple of different mechanisms that are coming into play here. One being direct oxidation of PFAS. And so what that is these PFAS molecules in solution will diffuse to the electrode surface and lose electrons directly at the electrode surface and become oxidized that way. There's also another pathway called indirect oxidation, and that occurs in the bulk solution where PFAS is being oxidized by these hydroxyl radical species that are present and are formed during the process. And where these come from is from water splitting. So where the energies required for the PFAS oxidation are high enough to induce water splitting reactions as well to form these hydroxyl radical species that can indirectly oxidize PFAS. And so both of these mechanisms are working together in order to oxidize PFAS. And ideally what you would get is something called complete mineralization, where we're transforming PFAS to its constituent parts, which are carbon dioxide and fluoride anions. And so with that, like I mentioned, we're working with fairly high current densities when we do these reactions. And so we're limited in the choice of materials that we can use for these electrochemical oxidation cells. And so like I mentioned, my center focuses on diamond technologies. So the material that we work with is boron doped diamond, which has been used pretty extensively for electrochemical oxidation processes. And there's a number of reasons why we like boron doped diamond for this purpose. Number one, it has a high oxygen over potential or a low activity for the oxygen evolution reaction. And this is important because the oxygen evolution reaction, or OER, is a competing reaction that can occur at the same time as the PFAS oxidation. So the more OER you have going on, the fewer electrons you have available to do the reaction that you want, which is the PFAS oxidation. So BDD having a low activity for that reaction is a good thing in this respect. It's also a weak absorber of hydroxyl radical species. So like I mentioned on the previous slide, there's that indirect oxidation pathway where PFAS is being oxidized by these hydroxyl radicals in solution. And so we want those to be freely available in order for that reaction to go. BDD is also very stable under these typically pretty harsh conditions that we're putting it under. So like I've mentioned, these are high current densities that we need to apply. So it's a lot of energy that's required to oxidize those CF bonds. And often for long periods of time. So I'll show you in the data, we perform this process for several hours at a time. We can also have different pH conditions. So BDD is stable over a wide pH range. And also just the complexity of the solution matrix. So I'm going to be talking about leachate, which has PFAS certainly, but also other organic species, heavy metals and other things that can be present in there and can potentially foul electrodes. So the BDD has been demonstrated to be very stable and resistant to fouling in those complex matrices. Also, we can fabricate BDD in multiple geometries. So that's what's being shown in these images on the right-hand side here. We have a couple of different BDD electrode stacks that we use for experiments. One is our parallel plate cell, which is just a series of parallel plate BDD electrodes that are housed in this PVC pipe shown here. And then all the way on the far right is our flow through cell, which is a series of circular electrodes with holes in them. So what's happening here is the solution is flowing perpendicular to the electrode surface. And between these two cells, we have different conditions in terms of electrode surface area, different solution flow behavior, mass transport kinetics, and things like that. And so that gives us differences in PFAS transformation kinetics. And so just to get into the data on landfill leachate, we have a project with the City of Grand Rapids Water Recovery Facility who supplies these different landfill leachate solutions to us. And what we're doing here is we wanted to figure out what electrochemical oxidation conditions are required in order to treat landfill leachate from different landfills, and also the same landfill from collected in different months. And so what we found is that across the board, we need current densities a minimum of 50 milliamps per centimeter squared in order to effectively degrade PFAS. But that the PFAS transformation during this EO process depends on the leachate composition. So you can see in the plots shown here that we're looking at 3 different landfills. So we're calling them A, B, and C. And between those 3 landfills, there are differences in the total PFAS concentration initially, and then also in how that PFAS is being transformed during the EO process. So you can see the different fluctuations in the concentration over time there. And in particular, if you look at the 2 different landfill A solutions collected in different months, so between January and February, there's a very significant difference in what happened to the PFAS during this process. And that first plot for landfill A collected in January, we actually saw an increase in the total PFAS concentration over time. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that the reason for that on the next slide, but basically this is just showing that this is it's a very difficult matrix to work with because it is constantly changing. Yep. So with that one particular leachate solution where we saw that increase in the total PFAS concentration over time, what we suspected that was due to transformation of precursor compounds, PFAS precursors, which we've heard about a couple of times in the talks this afternoon. So that was a good lead into this, I think. So what we did to kind of test this is, first of all, we took that leachate solution And on the previous slide, we were showing these 6-hour experiments, but we said, okay, what happens if we extend the treatment time? So that's what we did here, where instead of 6 hours, we ran an EO experiment for 32 hours and looked at how the PFAS was transforming over time, over that extended time. And what we saw was, once again, for the initial part of the experiment, from that 0 to 8 hours in this case, there's an increase in the PFAS concentration like we saw before. But after that point, we start to see a decrease in the total PFAS concentration again. And so we thought that this was due to sort of a two-step process where we have a transformation of precursors occurring in the beginning, followed by PFAS degradation after that. And so to check this, we sent off samples for top assay, which we just heard about on in the previous talk. But just to reiterate, what we're looking at here is measuring the PFAS concentration in the initial sample and then applying a treatment to that sample to oxidize all those precursor compounds, and then measuring the PFAS concentration again. With that, you can get a difference between the pre-treatment and the post-treatment. So the light blue bar here is the measure of that difference, which gives you an approximation for the precursor concentration present in your sample.
About
And
3
so
minutes left.
oh, thank you. And so we submitted samples at the initial sample at 0 hours, which corresponds to the same 0 hour on the plot on the left-hand side. And so you can see that there's quite a high precursor concentration present in that sample, whereas after 8 hours, that precursor concentration has decreased substantially. So this kind of backs up our thinking that we've got sort of this two-step process where we have to oxidize those precursors before we enter a phase where we're actually degrading PFAS. And so what this does is just the implications under our current set of conditions for this process is that we just simply need a longer treatment time in order to achieve PFAS degradation. So just to briefly summarize what I've talked so far about, for these different leachate solutions, we found that we need at least 50 milliamps per centimeter squared to degrade PFAS, and that the leachate is not consistent, and that's probably to be expected. It varies quite a bit between landfills and over time in the same landfill. And what really seems to be complicating things for our process is this precursor concentration between these different leachates. And so if you've got this high precursor concentration in a leachate, your treatment time is going to be extended just due to the need to transform those precursors before you degrade the PFAS. So some ongoing efforts in our lab dealing with this.
1
Number
minute,
one,
sorry.
oh, thank you. So number one, we're trying to identify these precursor compounds. We've sent off samples for that quadruple time of flight mass spec that we learned about in the previous talk to a collaborator. We actually just got the data back, so didn't have time to really analyze it before this talk. But we're really excited to see what we find there, and if we can, uncover some things about the chemistry. Also, pre-treatment technologies, we have several other projects dealing with this because what I showed here was just treatment of the raw leachate, but we're definitely interested in sort of a treatment train approach where we do some sort of pre-treatment or pre-concentration step prior to the electrochemical oxidation to improve the efficiency of the whole process. And then finally, taking all this together and scaling up the system. So all I've shown so far is a lot of proof of concept on a 2-liter scale, but we really want to take this to a larger scale that's more relevant to people like the water recovery facility. Thank you to the Grand Rapids Water Recovery Facility and Eagle who funded this work. And then all the people here are various Fraunhofer staff, students and graduate students working on this, particularly Vanessa Maldonado, who's been doing this project towards her PhD. And thank you all for your attention.